A little boy and a little girl. In the big town, where there are so many houses and people that there isn't room enough for everybody to have a little garden, and where in consequence most people have to content themselves with flowers in pots, there were two poor children who had a garden somewhat bigger than a flower pot. They weren't brother and sister, but they were as fond of each other as if they had been. Their parents were near neighbors, living in two attics, where the roof of the one house touched the other, and the gutter ran along the eaves. A small window in each house faced the other. You had only to step across the gutter and you could get from one window to the other. The parents had each of them a large wooden box outside the window, and in it grew kitchen herbs which they used, and also a little rose tree. There was one in each box, and they flourished wonderfully. Then the parents thought of putting the boxes across the gutter in such a way that they reached almost from the one window to the other and really looked like two bunches of flowers. The pea plant hung down over the boxes, and the rose trees put out long branches and twined about the windows and bent over to meet each other, and made almost a triumphal arch of leaves and blossoms. The boxes were very high up, and the children knew they must not climb up into them, but they were often allowed to get up to meet each other and sit on their little stools beneath the roses, and there they used to play very happily. In winter, of course, that pleasure was gone. The windows were often quite frozen over, but then they would heat copper pennies on the stove and then put the hot pennies on the frosty pane, and there came a beautiful peephole, as round and round, behind which peeped out a blessed little kind eye, one out of each window, the little boys and the little girls. He was called Kay and she Gerda. In summer, they could get to each other with a single jump. In winter, they had first to go down a lot of stairs and then up a lot of stairs while the snow came drifting down outside. Those are the white bees swarming, said the old grandmother. Have they got a queen too? Asked the little boy, for he knew that the real bees have one. Indeed they have, said grandmother. She flies where they swarm thickest. She is the biggest of them all, and she never stays still on the ground, but flies up again into the black cloud. Many a winter night she flies through the streets of the town and peeps in at the windows. And then they freeze into wonderful patterns like flowers. Yes, I have seen that, said both the children, and they knew it was true. Can the Snow Queen get in here? Asked the little girl. Let her come, let her come, said the boy, and I put her on the hot stove and she'll melt. But grandmother stroked his hair and told them stories about other things. In the evening, when little Kay was at home and half undressed, he climbed up on the stool by the window and peeped through the little hole. A few snowflakes were falling outside, and one of them, the biggest of them all, remained lying in the corner of one of the flower boxes. This flake grew larger and larger, and at last turned into a complete shape of a lady, dressed in the finest white gauze, which seemed to be made of millions of star-shaped flakes. She was very pretty and delicate, but she was of eyes, blinding, dazzling eyes, yet she was alive. Her eyes gazed out like two bright stars, but there was no red or quietness in them. She nodded towards the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened and jumped down off the stool, and then it seemed as if a large bird flew past the window. The, the next day was clear and frosty, and then came a thaw, and after that came springtime, and the sun shone, and the green buds peeped forth. The swallows built their nests. The windows were open, and the children sat once more in their little garden, high up in the gutter in the topmost story. That summer the roses blossomed as never before. The little girl had learned a hymn in which there was something about roses, and at the mention of them she thought of her own, and she sang the hymn to the little boy, and he sang it too. The roses grow in the valley where we meet the Jesus child. The little ones held each other by the hand and kissed the roses and gazed into God's bright sunshine and spoke to it as if the child Jesus were there. What lovely summer days were those, and how blessed it was to be out among the fresh rose bushes, which seemed as if they would never leave off blossoming. Kay and Gerda were sitting looking at a picture book with beasts and birds in it, and then just as a clock in the great church great church tower, the great church tower was striking 5, Kate said. Oh, something pricked my heart, and I have got something in my eye. The little girl put her arm round his neck, and he winked his eye, but no, there was nothing to be seen. I think it's gone, he said, but it wasn't. It was one of those tiny bits that were broken off the glass. The troll glass, you remember about that horrid glass which made everything great and was good that was reflected in it become mean and ugly. While the evil nasty things came out, and every blemish was plain to be seen. Poor Kay! He had got a piece of it right into his heart, which would soon be like a lump of ice. For the moment, it wasn't doing any harm. Still, there it was. What are you crying for? He asked. It makes you look horrid. There's nothing the matter with me, he called out suddenly. That rose there's worm eaten. And looked at that other. It's all crooked. Rotten roses they are, after all, like the boxes they're in. With that, he gave the box a hard kick and pulled off the two roses. What are you doing, Kay? Cried the little girl. And when he saw she was frightened, he pulled off a third rose and ran in at his own window, leaving dear little Gerda. Later, when she brought him the picture book, he said it was only fit for babies. And when grandmother told them stories, he was always breaking in with the but. And if he could, he would follow her about with spectacles on and imitate her talking. It was exactly like and made people laugh. Very soon he could imitate the walk and talk of everybody in their street. Everything that was odd or not nice about them, Kay could mimic, and people said, that boy's got an uncommon wit, to be sure. But it was the bit of glass he had got in his eye and the bit he had in his heart. So it came around that he would tease even little Gerda, who loved him with all her heart. The games he played were quite different now. They were very clever. One winter day, when the snowflakes were drifting down, he brought a big magnifying glass and held up the corner of his blue jacket and let the flakes fall on it. Look, now look through the glass, Gerda, he said. And there was every flake made much bigger and looking like a beautiful flower or a tempered star. Lovely it was to see. Look how clever it is, said Kay. It's much more interesting than the real flowers are, and there's not a single thing wrong with them. They're perfectly accurate if only they didn't melt. A little later, Kay came in with big mittens on, and his sledge hung on his back. She shouted to Gerda right in her ear, I have got leave to drive in the big square where the others are playing. And he was off. Out there, in the square, the boldest of the boys often used to tie their sledges to a farmer's cart and tried a good long way with it. It was excellent fun. At the height of their sport, a large sledge came by. It was painted white all over, and in it was someone wrapped in the shaggy white fur and wearing a shaggy white cap. The sledge drove twice round the square, and little Kay made haste and tied his own little sledge to it, and drove off with it. Faster and faster it went into the next street. The driver turned his head and nodded to Kay in a friendly way. It seemed as if they knew each other. Every time Kay thought of losing his sledge, the driver nodded again, so Kay stayed where he was. And they drove right out through the town gate. Then the snow began to fall so thick that the boy couldn't see his hand before him. As he drove on, and he hastily loosed the rope so as to let go of the big sledge. But it made no difference. His little trap held fast to it, and it went like the wind. He called out loudly, but no one heard, and the snow drifted down, and the sledge flew onward. Sometimes it made a bound as if it were going over ditches or fences. He was in a dreadful fright. He tried to say the Lord's Prayer, but he could only remember the multiplication table. The snowflakes grew bigger and bigger, till at last they looked like the large white hens. Suddenly they parted. The big sledge pulled up, and the person who was driving in it rose. The fur and the cap were all snow. It was a lady, tall and slender, shining like the snow queen. "We have traveled well," said she, "but you mustn't freeze. Creep into my bearskin." She put him beside her in the sledge and felt as if he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" he asked, and kissed him on the forehead. It was colder than ice, and struck straight to his heart, which itself was almost a lump of ice. He felt as if he was dying, but only for a moment. Then all was right. He didn't notice the cold about him anymore. "My sledge! Don't leave my sledge behind!" That was the first thing he remembered. So it was tied on to one of the white hens, which flew after them, the sledge on its back. Once more the Snow Queen kissed Kay, and he had forgotten little Gerda and grandmother and everyone at home. "No more kisses now," said she, "or I shall kiss you to death." Kay looked at her. Very pretty she was, a clever, fair face he could not imagine. She didn't seem now to be of ice, as she was when she sat outside the window and beckoned him. In his eyes she was perfect, and he felt no fear. He told how he knew mental arithmetic and with fractions too, and the area of the country and how many inhabitants, and she smiled all the time. Still, she thought that what he knew didn't count too much. They gazed up into the endless spaces of the air, and she flew on with him, flew high among the dark clouds, and the storm wind whistled and roared as if it were shining on balance. Over forest and lake they flew, over sea and land. Below them the cold blast whistled, the wolves howled, the snow sparkled. Above them flew the black cawing crows, but over all shone the moon large and bright. By its light Kay watched through the long, long winter night. By day he slumbered at the feet of the Snow Queen.